Welcome to the Social Evolution Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Michael Porcelli.
And I'm Max Borders.
And we're here to talk about the future of humanity, social evolution, and all that good stuff.
I'd love to hear about who you are. I'm sure everybody else would too. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a coach and a consultant. I have a business called Bedrock Culture and Leadership. I work with people everywhere from the soft skills side of things, interpersonal communication and how to do that effectively, all the way to organizational systems like holacracy and kind of future thinking oriented organizational structures. That shit gets me excited every day.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like your organizational focus is really living and breathing this stuff.
Yes, totally.
Okay. And we'll definitely talk about organizations, how they are constituted, how they're run, all that good stuff in subsequent episodes, perhaps also in this one. But it's really great to be on air, as it were, with someone who actually walks the walk.
Yeah, it's not always easy, but it is definitely rewarding. How about you, Max? Tell us about you, where you're coming from, what has you interested in this?
Well, I come from a little bit more from abstraction land, which you're happy to play in, even though you roll your sleeves up and do it. I'm a writer and a thinker. I have two books that I would love everybody to get as listeners: The Social Singularity, and my latest book is After Collapse.
Awesome. These books, I can attest. I just could not put down The Social Singularity when I first got it. It felt like Max was kind of saying stuff that I always wanted to write myself. And After Collapse is a great sequel, and I'm partway through it right now. And if you're interested in thoughts about like where basically civilization could be headed and the pitfalls and a sense of, I would say, optimism, even though After Collapse sounds like a little hardcore. I like the after part of that title. I think it's a well-chosen title. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about. We're literally sitting here together talking because of the first book, and I'm so happy about that. We've connected, become great friends, and we've decided to have conversations about this stuff all the time because we're nerds.
Yep. So then we decided, let's just record ourselves having these conversations that we already love having and have you listen in, and hopefully it'll be interesting and enlightening. Like I love talking about this stuff whenever I get the chance, and Max is one of my favorite people to talk about it with. So with that, let's get into it.
Let's get into it. What is social evolution anyway? I mean, what is this stuff we're going to be talking about?
My take is, we as humans are another species of animal on Earth, and we're in an evolutionary process. And we have been, for the entirety of our history, but also our prehistory. And this kind of stretches back into the mists of time. And it's not just we evolve like as individual people. We actually evolve as a collective, as a species, or as groups. And in the historical period from, the beginning of civilization, whatever, 12,000 years ago, we evolve in these societies and in these different structures, political structures or technological things or economic things, and that's brought us to here. And our premise, I think, or one of my premises, is that the evolutionary dynamic it's not done. It's going to continue, and we should expect it to continue and continue within our lifetimes. And just because it's the way we've always done it doesn't mean it's the best way to keep doing it. And there's definitely better and worse ways of doing it. So I think we're talking about this relationship between the kind of underlying sort of deep time evolutionary dynamic and, where we're headed into the future.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a very similar view on that, actually. And I actually like to divide the forces that shape humanity. Let's call them forces, broadly speaking, or dimensions along which humanity gets shaped. I think there are four. If anyone has an idea about what another might be, I'd love to hear it. But the four I really like to focus on are culture, which I think are the patterns of thought and behavior within groups, social groups. Then there's evolution. We're born with certain genes, and there are certain things about ourselves we cannot change, despite the culture, despite the environment. But those twin forces are very powerful. then as human beings, we come up with tools and recipes that we use to improve our lives or improve the lot of the people we love or the people around us, our communities, and so on. And that's technology. Technological tools, of course, are already shaping us. Right now, they have shaped us in the sense that you and I are sitting here having a transcontinental conversation that's being recorded, which would not have been possible 100 years ago, perhaps. And finally, then there's institutions, and these are the rules of the game in life. These are the formal and some informal, and this, of course, overlap with all the other areas, but these are the rules by which we have to live sometimes and sometimes choose to live, but nevertheless, the rules of the game. And those are my four forces for how we evolve as species, broadly speaking, where evolution and emergence are these twin pillars of change, and in those four categories. So curious to get your any contradictions you might have with that. Is there anything wrong there?
Well, I'm gonna get curious about what you mean by it to kind of help me clarify for myself what you're talking about. But I think this is a great framework. I think we, just to reiterate, we've got past, present, and future, which is maybe the time dimension, but then we have this kind of like 4 area dimension, and one of them I think is simple enough, which is the thing I said earlier about we're a biological species. We have genes, right? We have a certain, you might say, kind of like our range of behaviors is sort of within the parameters of, like, hey, we are these organisms, right? We stand upright, this about this size and shape, and all of the implications of that is just deep evolutionary history, these adaptive ways that we interact with each other. That's sort of like you call it like the animal sociality kind of aspect of it. I think that's kind of what you're getting at with that, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're a species that's evolved to feel jealousy. We're evolved to feel love, physical attraction. There's all of these other dynamics of part of being a human being that are parameterized by our genes. There are limitations currently to our cognitive abilities. The smartest person on earth might have an IQ of 220, but there's never been anyone who with an IQ of 400. But could that change? Who knows?
Right. Yeah. And these are basic things too, like everyday things. Like we got to eat food, right? We got to sleep.
Yeah.
Right? Like these are sort of constraints on our behavior that, for better or for worse, we're stuck with, at least for the time being. I mean, we can get into transhumanism maybe in another future episode here, but like at the very least, that dimension has to be accounted for. And let's go on to the second one you said was culture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, culture is one of these words that so many people mean so many different things by culture, but you said something about just the kind of the patterns of behavior and norms we have with each other, the values we share. I don't know if you said that word, but like, is this, there's a way that I start wondering like how these maybe get a little gray at the edge between each other, like the difference between like something that's an institution versus a culture, right? Like, or like biological versus a culture. What is it that makes it cultural?
Well, and there's so many interesting things in all the blurry spots in between. So if you imagine these 4 as being like Venn diagram circles, and they overlap in interesting ways, and looking at those overlaps is often really interesting. I mean, something as simple as a rule that Americans hew to pretty faithfully from coast to coast.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have international listeners, I'll be interested in any comments or otherwise reflections on other cultures and the way they do things. But I know that in the United States, we get in a line, we queue up.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at the grocery store, there's someone standing there, you're supposed to get behind them. And that's just the way things are done. But if you go to Germany and want to get on a bus, everybody's trying to get in the bus at the same time, and they're pushing each other out of the way. When I was first in Germany, I was appalled by this because, well, I'm an American and that's my culture. That is that the queuing up thing is a defined rule. So in that sense, it's an institution. But in another sense, there is a cultural dynamic around it that has to do with being an American, and it probably comes from the power of British or English culture in particular, where
Mm,
queuing up is also a cultural phenomenon and an institutional rule. So I love exploring these areas of overlap, and I think you're absolutely right. They're not fixed categories. They're definitely porous, and there's interesting areas of overlap.
Let me see if I can get to the heart of the culture thing. Like what makes it sort of unique or what's at the center of it rather than kind of these overlapped areas. Is it in your mind? Let me just share with you my version of it and see if there's congruence here. Like the culture part is it's informal, right? It's informal and it's sort of like soaked up in kind of implicit ways, right? It's almost like early childhood development, like the mimicry of, what your parents do. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a way almost like through osmosis. It's not even like maybe this is sort of where it starts to bump up against biological evolution a little bit too. Like but whatever this is, the cultural part is, it's transmitted primarily through informal relational context with the people in your immediate vicinity as you're developing. And whatever this is, customs or songs or turns of phrase or sayings or social norms like the queuing thing. This is the way I think of culture kind of at its heart. And I'm kind of curious, does this line up with what you're talking about?
It does, absolutely. I generally find with an abstraction like culture, it's useful to give examples because examples can often be better than definitions.
Sure.
So I would have a hard time defining culture. I think a lot of people would, but it's sort of like jazz. You know it when you hear it,
Yeah,
kind of thing. And I guess for me, to take an example, if you've ever met someone from the military, there is a sense of honor and loyalty that's very strong that tends to be inculcated in service people, but it's also shores up certain kind of structures or institutions within the military hierarchy, right?
Right.
So it's important that that if you're going to protect these institutions, that you have this coevolutionary culture to shore it up.
Yes.
And we think there are some really strange cultures if we think back into the past. For example, the shame of a Japanese warrior at losing a battle and finding himself alive afterwards. He might commit seppuku, which is ritual disembowelment that leads to suicide. Right? That's very strange to us culturally, but for, the Japanese in the 15th, 16th centuries, this was very common, at least among the warrior caste or the warrior class of Japanese society. So understanding the dynamics and interplays between technology, institutions, culture, and our own evolution as a species is just a massive playground for us to play in.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's clear enough. An example that was popping in my mind was, I grew up in California, and my family on my dad's side is the East Coast Italians, and we'd go for family vacation young. And I remember certain things just felt really different. Like, like the neighbors would just come over. You know what I mean? Like, hey, come on in. You know what I mean? And it was like, and there was enough dinner. There was like, you want dinner? You sit down. It's like, oh, so everyone's just cooking sort of an excess, and you never know if you're going to go over there or they're going to come over here, and they grab your face and they kiss you on the cheek. And I'm like, well, this is definitely, we're not talking about technology, right? We're not talking about like a law or a social institution here, like in a formal sense.
Right.
And we're not talking about biology either, because we're all humans, right? There's a sort of an interesting thing where like geographically, even within the same country, it's kind of like, oh, this feels a little different to me. And anyone who's traveled to a different culture or maybe moved across the country or whatever, they kind of get a sense of what we're talking about. These are just kind of this bundle of formal and informal sort of rules and ways of doing things that could easily be one way or another way, right? But this is part of what shapes us going forward as a society.
Well, and we have these cultural norms, right? And now that we got a better idea about what we say when we mean culture, and I'm hoping we do, at least I think you and I have woven a shared reality.
Yeah.
Hopefully we have with the listeners. But then all of a sudden something profound happens and a technological innovation drops in the middle of some culturally accepted state of affairs, which are very important to respect. Don't get me wrong. But sometimes innovation comes in and goes, wham. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
The birth control pill drops in 1960. What then? Everything changes. For example, we see women in the workforce like never before. And this was, of course, an echo of women in the workforce during the time when all the men were off in World War II. But when the men came back, they sort of, exercised a patriarchal sensibility that they had inherited from the past and muted the aspirations of women to remain in the workforce. And we got the 1950s, which was, Betty Crocker in her high heels, making lovely casseroles in the kitchen, right? And then, of course, men going off to work and earning the bread and coming home and all that good stuff. 1960 hits, and all of a sudden, women are able to control their reproductive health like never before, and so are not as dependent on men in certain ways. Completely changes the dynamic into the 70s. We get the women's libers movement, as the men called it, but as the women called it, the early days of feminism.
Yep.
And wow, what a profound transformation. But a lot of people don't connect it with a technological change. And that's really the important thing there. Of course, there were other factors that brought that about, but the birth control pill was certainly a big one.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's a really great example of an interaction. And, there's definitely a lot more that could be said about that example in specific, but to generalize it more, there's like other sorts of examples, like how the printing press changed Europe and the spread of ideas at that time, or how the invention of antibiotics or vaccines really changed the ways that disease spread through populations and actually, really affected what we now call public health, these kinds of ideas, or what the internet is still doing to our minds and our brains kind of collectively in the ways that we interact and communicate. I think sometimes it's not like a simple cause and effect relationship, right? Like the entirety of history, innovation, like you said, these dimensions, institutions, and the previous technologies that we've created lead us to create further technologies. And sometimes we don't totally grasp the implications of that, in a whole bunch of areas sometimes are sort of surprising to us.
Well, and you know what? You just figured out number 5. And the one I didn't list was this 5th major force that shapes humanity.
Oh, yeah?
Obviously, is nature, Mother Nature, the world in reality around us.
Sure.
When you mentioned antibiotics, that was a response to a natural phenomenon that we'd finally figured out. And of course, we can't neglect what nature does to us. Hell, we're talking still at the tail end of, but in the middle of a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic. And the world around us, our culture, our technology, our institutions, all have changed by virtue of the fact that we're living in a pandemic right now. So adding nature to the list.
This is like forces of nature, acts of God, the weather, the climate,
right?
An asteroid that could hit us.
Exactly.
Like these things that are not really fundamentally under our control. I mean, in a way, some of it's evolutionary, right? If we talk about, infectious agents as sort of evolutionary, or like predatory animals as evolutionary, but it's not the evolutionary of our species. It's really more of the evolution of the ecology around us. Right, like how we interact with the greater forces of nature. So yeah, I mean, I could see that as a distinct 5th thing, or if you want to blob the first one together, you can just call it biology or something. I don't know. Maybe I like it. It's good.
Right on. Have you ever heard the story of a guy named Semmelweis? He was a Hungarian physician who was basically. He was working in a hospital in Vienna back in the middle 1800s.
Uh-huh.
You ever heard the story about this guy?
Tell me more. I think maybe.
Well, so I want to compare and contrast two different ideas to hopefully come to an interesting synthesis. So Semmelweis was this doctor who basically, some of the doctors were using corpses to teach young intern doctors how to their craft, and they didn't want them to operate or otherwise treat live people yet because they're young. So they would go get these corpses, handle the corpses, and part of that required sticking your hands into the bodies of these cadavers. Well, what Semmelweis noticed was that the people who were working with cadavers, he started to note the people who were working with patients and live patients, mind you, not the dead ones, working with live patients, were also the people who were working with the cadavers, showed a higher incidence of the patients dying of what's called childbed fever. And they were basically bringing bacteria, which we know today because we have a sophisticated understanding of germ theory.
Mm-hmm.
But they would go to Semmelweis noticed that people who handled the cadavers were also making patients sick.
Yes.
So what he did was he encouraged everybody to use this substance, which we know today is, I think, just chlorine, and they washed their hands in chlorine water, and they were able, and he started saving patients left and right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the medical establishment was so entrenched in its groupthink that it absolutely, that they basically said Semmelweis was a joke, that this wasn't medicine, and they carried on with their ways for many, many more years. And he was essentially ostracized from the medical community and ended up dying of sepsis in prison somewhere. And I don't remember why.
Wow.
But the interesting thing is he was right. The medical community was wrong, and they were suffering under a kind of cultural groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
Now, contrast this story with the Jews, the ancient Jews under Mosaic law, where before every meal, you wash your hands. And this was considered a sacred rite. It wasn't considered, okay, get rid of the germs. It was considered a rite that would be a way to honor God. You know, God is blessing your food, or God is providing your food through his power, his grace, whatever Jews call it. I don't want to mix in the Christian language too much, but you get the idea. Mosaic law was about these rituals and rites, which you might call both culture and institutions, and they were spared for so many of the diseases and plagues that their neighbors weren't spared from.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting to see that contrast. On the one hand, you have a really highly developed culture of hand washing that worked for the Jews and allowed them to survive and thrive despite persecution from all their neighbors. And then you had hospitals dying, and Semmelweis had done really good social science to figure it out and could not overcome the barriers. That is a great example, I think, of the power of culture both ways.
Fascinating. Yes. Yeah. There's something about culture that it wants to, in a sense, preserve itself and replicate itself into the future. You know, this is a little bit of borrowing the ideas of Dawkins and the meme and memetics and whatever you think of that idea, like this broader concept that there is an evolutionary dynamic in the cultural dimension is, I think, true, you know, in a way. These things that get handed down for as long as they get handed down for work, right? Like that's sort of, it's almost like a survivorship thing. It's literally just like survival in the biological sense of evolution, right? The customs that make it, oftentimes we don't even know where they came from, but they have sort of built in frameworks like religion and tradition or whatever that help them continue down into the future. And they have a certain power, you know, whether the culture is like perpetuating something that's just really outdated, like in the case of the medical establishment thinking that Semmelweis is a quack, or the Jews perpetuating this idea of washing your hands before eating is a good idea, right? And both pre-exist the kind of scientific knowledge, the germ theory of disease, even being a thing.
Right.
Right. But they're both related to that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it leads me to ask, are you going to are we going to be allowed on this show to talk about politics and ideology in the context of all this?
This is a great question. There's a part of me that I think inevitably, we will talk about that. But my hope is that we talk about it at least one layer abstracted away from whatever you want, like the whatever the politics du jour is and the polarization du jour, and like look at it more kind of in the abstract, because this is maybe a good bridge to institutions. But I want to check if you wanted to say something about that. But like the politics is more in that institutional dimension that you're talking about, right? Policy, right? Like power, like how power is structured and distributed in a more formal way.
Exactly.
And I think that's
yeah. Well, and one of the things that's so interesting about you is you come from the integral background. And if for those who don't understand integral thinking, it's more or less, it's a whole lot of ideas together. But one of the sort of foundational ideas around integral theory is the idea, as the name would suggest, of integration.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of seeing different wisdom traditions, different worldviews, different ideologies, or different political views as being fundamentally at odds, and a tribe you have to choose and be on their team, as if it were Duke or Carolina, go Tar Heels. We have to, the integral theory would say, let's see what healthy wisdom and knowledge each of these traditions provides, and try to integrate it into our conceptual scheme to the extent possible, because it probably represents some larger, more multifaceted truth that we're not fully aware of without that ability to synthesize and look across traditions and ideologies for their wisdom value.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really important point, I think, in general, but also some of the things that we're going to explore on the show. What brought that to mind was the idea that conservatism, as a kind of doctrine or as a kind of way of looking at the world, really does could be healthy in the case of the Jews and unhealthy in the case of Semmelweis, right? So
yes.
Tradition
Mm-hmm.
is something that you honor in conservative teaching and conservative doctrine, because you don't know what you're going to fuck up if you try to change too fast, right?
Exactly.
If you stop washing your hands because somebody comes along with their liberal ideas and tells the Jews, okay, you don't have to wash your hands anymore because we've got a better way of doing it, which is doing the dance. Well, all of a sudden people are doing the dance and they're dropping like flies because they're ingesting bacteria and they're getting sick and dying.
Yep.
So likewise, though, the tradition of the medical establishment in Semmelweis ran contrary to the health of the people of Vienna. And that's an interesting counterpoint to this. So we want to try to find the healthy and unhealthy aspects of any kind of cultural phenomenon, doctrine, or whatever. And okay, you said, let's get to institutions. I'm curious as to how you view the idea of institutions, because as you said, and I agree, there's a formalized aspect to institutions or rules.
Yeah. So this is interesting. So institutions, I think there's sort of two senses of the word that are useful to kind of parse out here. Like if you said like the institution of marriage, it really is like a formalized custom. It's sort of like it's sort of more in the cultural dimension, or right on that borderland between culture and institution in your model here, where it's customary, but it's a very formal and ritualized custom. And there is some amount of like, in our modern world, kind of state recognition of that, and or sort of a set of, you might say, like default law or policy that kind of gets overlaid across that marital status. But then there's like the idea of formal institutions, which are things like actual states or the IRS or right the WHO, right? These organizations that, the Federal Reserve, they sort of carry out some portion of our civilization, social world.
Yeah, they're a functional aspect of
yes.
how we parameterize our behavior.
Yeah. So that's institution in the kind of formal organization sense. Like there's an actual entity,
an entity
that is the institution.
And people use that word interchangeably, institution and entity, especially if it's well established. And I really want to zoom in on one feature, and this comes from the Nobel laureate Douglas North, who speaks of institutions in New Institutional Economics and asks the question, what are the rules of the game? Mm-hmm. And of course, the rules of the game could be enforced by any number of institutional entities, but more or less, there's going to be cost to disobeying the rules, and there are going to be benefits to obeying the rules. And that creates all kinds of interesting human dynamics, because there's a point beyond which it's very difficult to go or more costly to go with respect to the rules. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, but that's the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about.
So along these lines, tell me a little bit about, the role of institutions in this evolutionary framework that we're talking about, right? This is the Social Evolution podcast, and we're not just talking about these things as fixed things. We're talking about them within this kind of time access, right? Like past, present, and future, right? Like how do we get here, and then where are we going, and how much do we want to preserve, like conserve, or how much do we want to change and like update or upgrade, and like what's the role that you see institutions playing in the evolutionary dynamic and the interplay with these other it's four dimensions?
It's probably in my mind, and in terms of my interest, the strongest and most powerful, most salient when we talk about the future, that and technology. So institutional rules and technological tools are going to be front and center on this podcast. I can go ahead and say that with confidence. So it's not to say that we won't talk about evolutionary phenomena. I love Daniel Dennett. I love the idea that that there's somehow we're programmed to find babies cute, but cuteness doesn't inhere in the world. It is evolutionary programming. I love the idea that nature has all these powerful forces that sometimes cause us to have to change. But I'm really interested in the institutional substrate and the technological substrate and how these are marrying with one another these days. So I'll give you a quick example, and then I want to get your reaction to this, because I think you think along similar lines, but I want to be sure. So there's this institution that's shored up pretty mightily by this entity called the Federal Reserve, which you just mentioned, and the Federal Reserve really governs in many respects the currency we use here in the United States, which is the US dollar. The US dollar is a powerful force around the world. It's the world's reserve currency currently, and it really doesn't have very many competitors. When you think about an institutional rule like the needing to use the dollar to pay for things in the United States, that has not really been disrupted over the last 100 years or more. Of course, in the early days of the Republic and with the Civil War, there was some competition with the Confederate dollar and this and that. But more or less, we've been living under a dollar regime, and living with inflation, because the intermarriage of the state, of the government, and the Federal Reserve has made this kind of unholy alliance that locks us in to using the dollar and being at the whim of other phenomena like inflation or the interest rate. Now, on about 2009, this guy, or guys, or women and men, we don't know who they are, but this person named Satoshi Nakamoto comes along and decides to change the tools in order to change the rules. Okay, we use this saying a lot, and listeners hopefully will appreciate it, which we've cribbed from somebody close to Marshall McLuhan ascribed this saying to Marshall McLuhan, the great Canadian philosopher. And it goes like this. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. And then, of course, you and I have a corollary that we shape our rules, and then our rules shape us. And when you combine technology that makes rules, like Bitcoin and the blockchain, all of a sudden you have a game changer. This is something that is continued to almost like a universal acid eat through. It has its fits and starts, it has its ups and downs, but Bitcoin has continued, as so have cryptocurrencies, to survive amid the regime, this prior regime that is the Federal Reserve. And so it's interesting, and we have to wonder, where is this going to end up? What is it going to have to do? What is the old order going to have to do to preserve itself? What is the new order going to have to do to emerge and flourish? Very interesting stuff.
Yeah. I agree. So, on a couple of points here, I want to just echo some things you said. One is, we could talk about biology and the environment, ecology, some of the time, but our center of gravity is going to be really in this dimensions that the human world, right? That we have more control over in a way, which is culture, technology, and institutions in your model, right? Like those 3 out of the 5, if we're working with 5 now.
Yeah.
So I would agree. And the center of gravity of our conversations will be there, just by virtue of the fact that we have more ability to influence that through conversations like this or through innovations like Bitcoin. And then to kind of go to this idea of the money, currency, the Federal Reserve, the dollar, Bitcoin, I think these are really elucidating some of the inner relationships between these dimensions that you said. So, money is an ancient technology, right? It's been around for thousands and thousands of years in one form or another. And you could say that kind of emerged out of cultural norms at the time around trade and exchange and trying to account for trade and exchange on a common platform or a common method of accounting or something like this, and then the creation of institutions like a bank or then a central bank, right? Or then a global reserve currency right? These things were sort of formal institutional expressions of kind of an underlying social technology or an informal institution, you might say, of like money. Like it's not as though we're going to free ourselves of currency of some kind, right? This is some kind of method, like I said earlier, like of accounting for things, a social signaling method of accounting for coordinating our efforts across huge populations. So in the sense that I think just to get more neutral about politics, which is my tendency, is like, I don't know if it's going to be Bitcoin or something else, right? Like, and I can sort of see, the benefits of something like the Federal Reserve and kind of the issues around it. Okay, cool. But whatever is to come in the future, it needs to at least succeed at the bare minimum, just as well as the previous system, right? If it's going to evolve, let's say it is a Bitcoin future, well, whatever Bitcoin does, it has to do something just as well as the dollar, as the global reserve currency does it, in terms of providing a common method of accounting across global marketplaces. You see what I'm saying? Like, and maybe we'll do other things that will make it better than something like the Federal Reserve and the dollar reserve currency system. And, hopefully we don't suddenly switch to something that has some unintended consequences and it makes everything worse, right? But like, I don't know, this is an interesting relationship between, the custom of trade, the informal institution of money, the formal institution of banks, right? Like, so it kind of actually it almost illustrates like this idea that what we're talking about in terms of social evolution actually requires sometimes a coordinated move forward across these multiple dimensions that you've picked out, especially these 3 core ones.
Well, I'll give you a good example of that. I think this is a good example. it has parallels with the GameStop stuff that happened recently. But I call it, let's call it hodl culture. You've heard of the expression hodl, right?
Yeah.
It's meant to, this guy was on Twitter and was drunk, and he's like, I'm just going to hold, and he misspelled hold as huddle.
Yeah.
And that got interpreted as an acronym, hold on for dear life. But that's essentially what it means is people say hashtag hodl, and it is really about keeping your crypto no matter what. And it's basically a commitment to the idea of Bitcoin or the idea of cryptocurrency rather than some purported intersubjective matrix of value, because the intersubjective matrix of value is bound up in culture for Bitcoiners and cryptocurrency enthusiasts. You hold on to it in order to never allow the old order for people to succumb to the exigencies of the old order, including the regulatory authorities or what you like, because it is a form of protest to that old order. Bitcoin is. So is cryptocurrency. And in many ways, so is blockchain. And we can talk about distributed ledgers in another episode. But the idea of hodl culture is really different from the question in the way that most people would view a stock, which is, how much do I think this is worth? How much do I think other people think this is worth? Which is really the what we're interested in when people are buying and selling stocks. It is also the question that is involved in talking about the value of this network called the Bitcoin network, to use the big dog as the main example. But that hodl culture is baked into it and is not separable from it. And I think we have to acknowledge that. That is because Bitcoiners are just as much revolutionaries as investors. And my hope is that as more and more people get into cryptocurrencies and get into blockchain, they don't get caught up in too many distractions that create bubbles, like I'm worried NFTs are going to become, but rather that they are still committed to a sense of mission, which is the subversive aspect of cryptocurrencies.
There's so much in what you're saying here. And, in a way, I'm reminded a little bit of our conversations around like the similarities and the differences between your two books, The Social Singularity and After Collapse. And, in The Social Singularity, there was a lot of emphasis on the tools, right? The system, the technology. And, of course, it kind of bled into this idea. I mean, that's where I first heard that quote, or we shape our rules and our rules shape us. Is like, oh yeah, that's great. Like in The Social Singularity. But in After Collapse, I think you're talking a little bit more about this interplay between something softer or maybe more amorphous, like culture.
Absolutely. That book is almost written because I felt unsatisfied having finished The Social Singularity, that I'd focused too heavily on rules and tools and neglected culture, specifically a sense of moral spheres. And I don't want to go too much into that, but just to say thank you for seeing that, because that is one of the biggest through lines of the book. It's subtle. Purportedly it's talking about how we're breaking down on various dimensions of society, and we're probably going to have a financial collapse soon. What do we do afterwards? But one of the biggest things I say that we need to do beforehand, if possible, but certainly afterwards, is reorient ourselves around basic mores, or even more importantly than mores, a deep sense of moral practice. One of the things I think you and I both agree that we call ourselves broadly cosmopolitan liberals. And liberalism as a doctrine really focuses in many ways on rules. And I do too. And I've always tended to be that way. It's like, what is going to be the foundations of the larger political order in terms of the laws you write. And I think that's important, but I think that as I'm growing older and I'm raising kids and the importance of morality with kids, but also I've come in contact with some of the wisdom traditions, the Vedic traditions, for example, the yogis, the Buddhists, and so on. And I'm coming to see that liberalism is kind of a bloodless, rule-oriented doctrine. It's kind of cold.
Mm-hmm.
And what is needed is this re-embrace of moral practice. Even the ancient virtues come to mind. If you, from your family's Catholic tradition, would honor the virtues probably, but also in Judaism, my wife and baby daughter are Jewish, so I'm learning a lot about Judaism and those the moral rules of Judaism, and thinking of morals as active practice, not as passive recitation or as being like rules, as more, this is something I need to do every day. Just like learning karate or practicing yoga or becoming a better singer or whatever. It's like, I've got to practice being good every day. I never thought I'd hear myself talk like that. And yet here we are, right? Like practicing, and I have 5 spheres that I enumerate in the book, but I encourage folks to read that to get a better idea about it. But to stay at this level of the conversation, yes, that cultural dimension, moral cultural dimension is so vital to how we evolve.
Yes. So I want to throw some ideas of my own in here that like support this and kind of start to get into like how these things interconnect, because we jumped off into this when you were talking about huddle culture, right? And like, it's not just some expression of an economic idea. It's just an expression of a revolutionary idea or like a social change idea. And, social change often, if not always, taps into something of like, this is ethical or good, right? A values-based argument, right? In more of a philosophical domain, like the idea of progress is often argued from the point of view of ethics and morality. And whatever it is that we're doing in the social dimension, there's some amount of negotiating what I call shared reality, which is, something you quoted me in your book on, which I was happy about, but this idea that like we are exchanging tokens of communication in order for us to see and understand our, where we have overlap in terms of our beliefs and ideas about the world. And like this, in a way, transcends across these 3 spheres of technology, culture, and institutions in some way, right? Like the belief that if you're going to talk about the dollar collapsing or something rising to take its place, it's not just like a rational argument, although that is often part of it, like around economic value, right? But there's also a sense of like a moral argument or being a stand for something. Or if you're like, the American revolutionaries, like there was a lot of arguing for the American Revolution that was taking place by people like Benjamin Franklin in the newspapers and in these, it's like we got to shift. We're not just shifting the external institution directly, but these things kind of have to move in coordination, right? And in order for them to move in coordination, roughly speaking, there's an amount of like, I think about it as like we're aggregating or cultivating belief, like a shared reality about what is possible, right? Like,
yes,
like that we can create a thing. The American colony is independent of the British rule, and we can't, like, or whatever it is, right? Like, and there's some amount of this conversation that's going on in today's culture here in America, especially, but I think worldwide amongst modern people in the aftermath of the invention of the internet, really. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about where that's come from. But that conversation is very rich right now. And like there are, I think, different, conversations, whether it's like, Game B or Glenn Wiles' Radical Markets, or, what does a post-Westphalian nation state look like? Or can we detach the idea of currencies from central banks? Like this is a very interesting environment to be having this kind of conversations. And like whatever the change is going to be, like any social movement, there's going to have to be some amount of, I guess it's solidarity is the word for it, right? Like
Yeah.
enough brains inside people who are like vibing on the same frequency about like, this is a worthy thing, right? Because it's like, if it's just in my own imagination, right, I'm living in a fantasy world, or I'm a sci-fi author, right, or something, right, or I'm a crazy person, right? But if suddenly we're like weaving shared reality about this new possibility and making arguments not just for the new structure or the technology, but we're making an argument that touches all the basis of like shared values, these things then drive forward together. And it seems like we're just on the cusp of this, or maybe in the middle of this evolutionary moment together.
I'm reminded of Deirdre McCloskey's term "sweet talk." It's marketing too. It's, hey,
Sure.
What do you think about this idea? I mean, so when you haven't woven shared reality yet, you've got to market it, and you've got to engage in memetics, sometimes mimetic warfare, and so building culture around some proposed idea of the future, as you put it. You use the term solidarity, which is perfect. I was thinking about when you use the term, when I was thinking about intersubjective agreement, which is sort of a Richard Rorty kind of phrase. And I love Richard Rorty. He's a philosopher from the 20th century who died on about year 2000 or so. In any case, he's got this idea called solidarity, which is really intersubjective agreement about shared reality. I love the way you put it as being woven.
Yeah.
And yet there are toxic and unhealthy versions of weaving shared reality, because if you think of it as being intersubjective, but it doesn't have any touch point with the world, with reality, with actual reality, with the way other people think and feel, you can start to live in a bubble or a universe that an unhealthy universe. And I'm thinking, for example, the anti-racism trope or tribe that's going around right now. Of course, there's a healthy civil rights notion of civil rights and equality that we want to preserve, right?
Yes.
If you're into spiral dynamics or integral theory, that's a healthy aspects of green meme. But there's also a very unhealthy and toxic, almost neo-segregationist aspect to this anti-racism stuff that mirrors racism almost completely. And frankly, that scares me, because now we're engaging in mimetic warfare, and it's almost as if, when you have the QAnon folks on the one side and the sort of social justice divorced from reality crowd on the other, neither of them is fully in touch with the real world, whether that be statistics about what humans actually do, think, and feel, or whether that's just the fact that no, you can't actually drink bleach to cure your COVID or whatever the hell thing that they've got going on in QAnon land.
Right.
So I don't want to piss on anybody's tribe. I just want to say that what's important about weaving shared reality is it have contact with actual reality, a mind-independent reality that ain't you and ain't your subjectivity. Yes. That's a hard thing to do and a hard thing to achieve, particularly in this day and age when everything we do is mediated by screens.
Yep, totally. I love what you're saying. I mean, you step on a couple of hot button things, and I'm going to try to just gloss over them, and you could choose whichever one you want as an example. But I think you are like, my favorite one to pick on is like flat earthers, because there's they're easy to make fun of. But yeah, you can create a kind of shared reality with a group. Cults do this oftentimes. Or
it's really fringe. It's fun to make fun of the round earthers, right? Hey, wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
Fuck you, Porcelli. No, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
It's funny. But the more important principle, I think, here is, as you said, like there's two things. Like one is recognizing this is a little bit of a truth of the postmodernist ideas around like what do they call it, like truth production, something like this is one of these kind of terms where it's like, what are the sociologists like this too, like especially any kind of 20th century philosopher or theorist that kind of focus more on the social dimension rather than the individual dimension. Like Habermas comes to mind. He's one of my favorite ones, but he's definitely not a postmodernist himself. But the ideas that they share is like, let's focus on the norms, the institutions, and the processes. You could even call them like discourse norms. That's one that I really resonate with, like that are help us in terms of weaving the shared reality together, better or worse, right? And you can have certain kinds of things. If there's a whole kind of fad almost of cult, or ex-cult member documentaries, people like leaving cults and such. And they talk about, you can sort of see these really tight set of like values and ways of discourse that get people really, really like into each other and into what they're up to, but further and further from the larger civilizational shared reality.
Yes.
Right. And then you have this kind of, at least the ideal of science is like, this is a process where, maybe the classic view of science was like, we're just testing this versus reality. And any person can like, test it for themselves, right? Like as an individual, like almost these heroic individuals like Galileo or something. But I think the 20th century version of science has really recognized the social dimension of the scientific process. And me working as an engineer in an earlier part of my career, recognized like, man, nobody, even a simple thing like a printer, like I worked at Hewlett Packard, we made printers. This thing is so complicated, nobody understands how it works. Just a printer, right? Like, and there's definitely a social dimension to what we're doing that is like helping that function carry out. So whatever, kind of like generalize this all the way, it's not just the technological innovation, right? It's also the construct around it, the structure, the process of the way that we communicate that creates new shared realities. And in a way, we could talk about rocks and gravity and things that are like hard objective reality. But a lot of what you and I are talking about in terms of institutions and culture, especially, these are largely, if not mostly, constructed out of something more ephemeral. It's actually constructed out of shared belief.
Yeah.
Right? Like the currency has a value. And this is very much something people are grappling with in the Bitcoin world, the post-cryptocurrency world, is like, wait, this has value because we say it has value. And like, this is not a new idea. Economists have talked about subjective theory of value as one way of construing value. But like, it's like, wait a minute. Okay, I guess this is just a symbol of an aggregated set of intersubjective reality or shared reality or solidarity. There's like actually a solidness to this thing in this weird dimension that is not exactly physical. It's social.
And whether it's healthy or unhealthy, frequently you cannot penetrate it. You might as well be trying to punch a steel beam. So shared reality that is constructed by social forces is strong as hell. It has its own tensegrity.
Yes.
Right? So and even it can even make us better people relative to our environment or worse people relative to our environment. There's an old story of East and West Germany where there's an article, a great article called "Lying Commies" in The Economist, right? Where they did a study a study of it's strange because they had these people play a game, but the study was about how people played the game. And the West Germans and the East Germans basically in certain age range grew up in two different cultures. They were neighbors. They were, from the standpoint of their genetic stock, if you like, they were very similar.
Mm-hmm.
They were German dudes or German men and women. But the ones who grew up in the East behaved very differently in the game than the ones who grew up in the West.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who grew up in the West had a more or less capitalist culture of repeated production and exchange. So, if you want to exchange with someone, you need to establish a relationship of trust. If you want to establish a relationship of trust, you don't lie, cheat, and steal, right?
Right.
But if you grow up in the bureaucratic matrix that is East Germany, you essentially were inculcated by the incentives of the system to be a liar and a cheater and do anything you could to get ahead, because to get behind in that system was death,
right,
or was misery.
Yeah.
And in any kind of backbiting bureaucracy, we see that kind of behavior, because it's very zero sum in how you get to the top. If I'm at this middle stratum, I have to have gotten there before someone else who started at the same time or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in situations where there is exchange, it's less formalized force and more choice and voluntary interaction. You have to establish trusting relationships.
Right.
And that contrast is so profound that it actually shaped the moral sensibilities of the people within those institutional matrices. Crazy stuff, but it does it to us every day. And so one of the things that I've been harping on about lately and talking about morality is that basically Americans are losing their religion, as it were, when it comes to being good people. For example, being compassionate people. Mm-hmm. We've lived in the welfare state so long, we don't know how to engage in mutual aid anymore. We are less charitable. Mm-hmm. Because we're so used to seeing politics as moral action, right? That to be for the poor is to go and vote for those who are going to, do something for the poor as politicians,
right,
is a very different thing from actually engaging in an act of compassion that would help the poor, or engaging in some kind of organization that helps improve civil society. And I'm starting to see Americans along many different dimensions: integrity, compassion, harm, basic physical violence, other kinds of stuff, that this is starting to get worse and worse.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I would agree about the symptoms. There's a little bit of the cause that you, I think you betrayed a little bit of your bias in there. I mean, some people basically say it's actually caused by, the worst aspects of capitalism and the incentives that creates, like, I think it's a little bit of both.
I acknowledge that it's both. In fact, it's like, if you have certain aspects of society that are of the moral universe that are taken out of society and taken to the political, but the rest of your actions belong to voluntary exchange and market in either the marketplace or the social cultural sphere.
Yeah.
If you take them out of those spheres, then yes, the capitalism stuff, the greed, can exacerbate the fact.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the welfare state is the worst possible combination.
Sure.
Because you have greedy people, selfish people taking selfies and trying to keep up with the Joneses, all while going saying, we need to vote for more help for poor people, rather than actually doing anything about it. Yeah. So it's nuts, and it makes Americans look really bad, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, this, I think, is a potentially another bookmark for future topics. I mean, there's a way I want to start moving us to a conclusion here together, but I think a lot of what we've talked about is maybe previews for future conversations.
Right.
Maybe we could take one aspect that we kind of referred to today and do a deep dive on it, like crypto or like moral philosophy or shared reality or discourse norms or something like this. But I do want to actually, for us to do a little bit of the thing we're talking about together, kind of maybe as a conclusion. What do you think?
Let's do it.
So what we're saying here is part of what the future of humanity is going to be, it's going to take place in all these dimensions, like we talked about, especially these core three: technology, institutions, and culture, because those are the ones we have the influence over. Part of that is going to be the story we tell ourselves about where we've come from and where we're going and what's possible. And we're in a world of like competing, you could call it narrative warfare, competing narratives. And some of these narratives, I think, are better or worse than others. And yes, they're stories, and they're stories in that sense of like a, like a scriptural story, right? It has sort of like a moral lesson to it, or a moral intention behind it. And some of these stories that just to kind of contrast what we're up to with some of these, like some of them are very depressing, right? Like they are very fatalistic. Like there's almost like a dark version of environmentalism, which is like, it's already too late. We've already destroyed the environment irreparably, and basically we're just going to go extinct. So we just spend the rest of our days as humanity just weeping over the fact that we committed suicide, right? That's the best we can do.
Yeah.
Just join hands and accept our doom, right? Like, I'm like, I'm sort of caricaturing a certain style of story, but like, that's not our story. That's not the shared reality that you and I want to weave here, right? Like, or the collapsitarians. There's a whole bunch of them out there. And I resonate a lot with long-termist thinking, these ideas of like, there are definitely catastrophic risks. And some of these are ones that we could self-generate. In fact, some of the ones that you're talking about, that kind of like collapse in the human dimension, are ones we definitely need to worry about. Like the monetary system is kind of your example from today and from the introductory material in your new book. But, that there's one version of that story, which is like, yes, and we're fucked, right?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
We're going to do this, and we're basically, it's not going to be environmental suicide. It's going to be another one. We're going to blow ourselves up with a nuclear disaster. We're going to collapse the global monetary system, and we're going to go all the way back to...
If we let these guys do CRISPR in their garages, somebody's going to let something out that changes the entire genome forever or whatever. Or lets out a super virus that transmits quickly but is as lethal as Ebola. Whatever. Right. I mean, there's people who are really interested in this existential risk stuff.
Yeah.
And usually their answer when you press them on what are you going to do about it, is that they just get really authoritarian really quickly. Which I also think
that's
is
another story.
Another existential threat.
Exactly. So that we should tease apart this exact thing, but in this world of like, what's the shared reality that we want to create, right? Maybe you and I will find ways that we actually diverge from this. But I think one of the things that brought us together as friends, and from me reading your book, is there's a kind of optimism that we have.
Yeah.
Like not a Pollyanna, like there are no existential risks, right? Like not just kind of like, progress just happens automatically. We don't need to worry about it. It's like, no. Like there are many ways, entropy is real, right? Like, you might say the darker side of human nature, I think, is real. We need to be concerned about these things. And, environmental issues are real. We need to worry about those too. There's a lot of things on that menu of global catastrophic risks or global existential risks that do need to be attended to and mitigated if we're talking about like a long-term future for humanity. But I think, at the center of our story, and I'll just speak for myself at this point, is like, humanity, to the degree we even can think of ideas of like what is good or what is beautiful or what is aspirational, that is coming from the collective dialogue of humans. Like, we are the moral agents in this story. And until we encounter another species somewhere that we can actually have ethical discourse with, we're it. So whatever is good is ultimately grounded in sort of what we say is good. And we're in a dialogue about like, how do we come together with this? And how much do we need to come together? How much pluralism can we allow for there to be? And like, I think there's a way that you and I, or speaking for myself, like I believe in the future of humanity. I believe that these risks are addressable, right? I believe, like systemic fragility or the monetary system or, the legacy of racism or environmental catastrophe or biological weapons, these things we must address them. Super intelligence, right? The super intelligence explosion, the big AI risk alignment problem people talk about. We need to address them. And I think it's possible that we can, that we should, and that we will. And at the very least, we need to believe that we could instead of giving up.
Right. On this, we consider the shared reality woven. The fundamental optimism I have is one I share with you, I think, and yet I say that as one who believes that we are, in some respects, and hopefully our listeners are operating in something of a bubble, but a bubble that I hope can enlarge, where the intersubjective matrix of conversations and optimism and commitment to understanding both each other and understanding the world as it is presented to us, that we can begin to can enlarge the circle of shared reality in a way that is healthy and in a way that doesn't cause us to develop a sky castle where no one can reach us or we may never fall. I find this to be the case troublingly with people who put the word meta in front of things too frequently. You and I have talked about this offline. We'll pick on the meta folks another day, but thinking meta is absolutely what we do, and it's important. But we also have to be able to broaden the circle of people with whom we engage in intersubjective agreement about the nature of reality, the possibility of the future, and of course, whether or not to be optimists, which is an outlook that also drives our behavior. And I think it animates our discourse in positive ways, so that when you and I talk about future possibilities and how we can make the world a better place, to use the Silicon Valley line from that great show.
Sure.
We are not just talking out of our ass, but we are connected not only with each other, but with some connection to how the world actually functions. And I think a lot of what's going on now is in the information ecology, as Daniel Schmachtenberger calls it, is a lot of pollution. And I think that pollution is because there's not a lot of cost associated with being wrong, or at least not a lot of cost associated with, there's no skin in the game. It's easy to be a part of a digital mob. It's easy to be a part of having groupthink if you're being rewarded generously within the group by some sort of identity and sense of belonging. I find that artificial. You have to marry solidarity with reality. And that's a tough thing to do. Because one of the things we did learn from postmodernism is there's no standing outside of ourselves to check the nature of reality. We are always going to be subjective. And our phenomenology has a locus point. But through communication and through healthy discourse, we can create a positive future. And I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah. So, if this sounds good to you and you're listening, please come back and join us for these discussions. And, hopefully we'll find points of contention between Max and me. I imagine there's places where maybe you go a little more pessimistic and I remain optimistic, or vice versa.
Oh yeah. Of
or,
course.
Maybe there's a way that one of us leans more towards the, in a conservative way, and one of us leans more towards a progressive way. And maybe we will switch positions depending on the topic. But whatever it is that we do, we hope that, we're open-minded and welcoming, especially of like healthy debate, and adding something to the discussion that is grounded in like our ability to converge in our differences, in our dialogue, but also for it to map back to reality somehow and somewhere. And like the skin in the game issue, I think, is one that is going to be interesting for us to kind of wrestle with ourselves. Like, are we just talking, right? Or how are we putting skin in the game in our respective, worlds and our domains? And what are we doing to help try to make that reality, or at least run experiments to see like what can get some traction versus another thing?
Well, the first thing we're doing is we're opening ourselves up to you, the listener, and there's some skin in that.
Yes.
I can't thank you enough if you got this far in the podcast, dear listener. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your spending this time with us, and know that Michael and I are interested in creating a lot more of these. Some of them will be more focused. Some of these will be more restricted to a certain topic, and sometimes we'll fly around and improvise. And I hope that you'll find both are good to your ear holes.
Right on. Join us again some point in the near future for another rendition of the Social Evolution podcast. And thanks for joining.